The village courthouse smelled of wet red earth and diesel. Amina stood with her belly tucked under an old wrapper while rain tracked down the corrugated roof, and her father, Chief Adebanjo, spat words that would erase her place from the family roll. The stakes were immediate and brutal. She would lose the house where she had learned to braid kola husks, the community's respect, and the only hope she had for the child pounding against her ribs. How would a baby feed without the roof over their heads? Who would teach him to say, "Mama," when the father had already decided to say nothing at all? What secret could possibly turn a father who had disowned his pregnant daughter into a man who could not keep his pride when the truth arrived 3 years later as a wealth he never expected? Amina pressed her palm to the little life inside and walked out under a harmattan breath that tasted of iron, leaving the courthouse courtyard with more questions than answers and a pocket empty of cash but not of stubbornness. Before the shouting in the courtyard, Amina's ordinary world had been small and bright. She cooked for her mother under the red eaves, swept the front of their yard in the mornings when danfo horns still announced the traders, and traded small bundles of dried fish at the market to pay for her younger brother's school fees. She believed in work that smelled of smoke and sweat, in prayer at the Methodist chapel with its creaking benches, and in the way her grandmother, old Beezy, hummed while kneading fufu. Those rhythms shaped what she would not betray: honor above show, love above gain. She loved her father despite the way he rolled his eyes at the poverty that clung to their compound like dust after harvest. The phrase, "Father disowned his pregnant daughter," became the wound she carried in private, an ache she wrapped in a shawl and brought into the marketplace each day. The knife of the inciting moment came swift. Chief Adebanjo slammed the compound gate and declared that Amina's belly was a stain on their name, that she would sleep in the street if she chose to keep the child, and when she refused to bow to his cruelty he threw down the letter of disinheritance like a stone, the paper fluttering into the pooled mud. She could still feel his words as if they had weight. "Your child is your shame," he had said, and when he left in his glossy SUV the compound's gate clanged like a sentence. Amina was suddenly homeless in a city that measured dignity by cars and cousins' weddings, and the baby inside her kept time with her quick, anxious breaths. The first night she slept on a bench under a generator's hum, wrapped in a borrowed sari, and asked the dark a small, bright question: where would she find work that paid enough to buy a roof before the rains returned? The first trial wore no mask. It was a market life stripped to the bone. Amina rose at 4, loaded her stall with akra shaped by aching hands, and listened to the bustle of traders who measured wealth by how their scales tilted. Money came in bundles of small notes. A child with a cough needed a clinic visit that cost half a day's takings. She learned the exact accuracy of how hunger bites a baby and how it gnaws at a mother's sleep. Hope arrived in the form of a man named Tund who offered her a room for rent and a soft voice that promised things like, "We'll find a way," but the kindness had a price: late fees, dangerous favors, and an evening when she discovered that Tund had been slipping unpaid goods into the back of his locker and blaming her for them. Amina's anger rose like the sudden flash of thunder over red earth. If she trusted once and it was returned with theft, what would she trust next?
The wolf in sheep's clothing was not grand. He arrived with a smile and a clutch of syllables about opportunity and a future for your son. Pastor Samuel, who ran the small feeding program, took her in for what seemed like a blessing and gave Amina a seat at his women's co-op. The church courtyard smelled of boiled yam and incense as Amina shared her story and her hope. He advised her to register for a microcredit loan and introduced her to a man who promised market access in exchange for a percentage, and at night Pastor Samuel would pat her hand like a father while she thought of the one who had disowned her. Then, like curtains pulled abruptly, the pastor's smile revealed its teeth. He demanded public gratitude in sermons, sold her waitlisted stalls to wealthier women, and when she finally confronted him, the program's records were conveniently misplaced. The betrayal left Amina with fewer allies and a ledger that turned small debts into cliffs she could not climb alone. A second pattern interrupt arrived with a letter tucked into the pocket of an old coat, a summons to appear as a witness in a farmers' rights case far upstate, an opportunity that smelled like red clay and real work. For a week she traveled with a group of women who tended cassava and cocoa under a blistering sun, their trucks rattling like old bones across potholes, and Amina learned how harvest turned into export, how money tripled hands before it reached the farmer. She returned with a notebook full of names and a small, stubborn idea, processing raw goods, adding value in the village before the lorry crossed the city line. But the urgency grew sharp when the microcredit collector began ringing 3 times a day, and a landlord's notice attached like a splinter to her door. Could she turn knowledge into cash before the debt swallowed her stall and the baby grew hungry? The question pressed again, haunted her like the close, dry breath of Harmattan. The second year tightened like a noose. Electricity cut like a scene change. The generator humming at the market grew louder as she tried to keep a small, cold box for milk. And every night she pinched her lips and calculated the cost of medicine versus flour. She found a partner, a quiet woman named Kimmy who smelled of palm oil and knew how to bargain with porters, promising they would save and buy a hand-crank dryer to process groundnuts for export. Money was slow, trust slower, and when they finally pooled enough for the dryer, a storm washed the roof off their little shed and molten river of mud ruined their first batch. Kemi's face crumpled then, and she suggested they borrow from a man she claimed was a distant cousin who invests in honest women's projects. Amina felt unease crawl under her skin because the man's ledger looked like the whisper of a trap. The pattern of small victories turning into new threats returned with a sharper edge. Then, one evening, as dusk set the red earth aflame and the mosque's call fell soft across the market, Amina did something she had not been able to afford. She fed a hungry mother with her last sachet of sugar and gave the woman the little jar of powdered milk she had been saving for a pitch. The woman, eyes swollen from crying, pressed Amina's hand to her forehead and whispered blessings into the air as if the city's noise could never reach such tenderness. A young courier who had paused to rest on a crate watched the exchange and tucked the memory away. This act of kindness cost Amina dearly in immediate cash, but it knitted something quieter. Someone had seen her put another's child before her own desperate arithmetic, and flashes of such character would return when the ledger of fate turned to pages of favor. The courier left with dirt on his shoes, the taste of sugar in his teeth, and a name held gently in his memory. 30 days became a countdown written on a folded scrap. 3 days until the microloan collectors came to collect everything and sell the stall, 3 nights until the landlord's notice expired, and the same 3 days in which the buyer from the port might still accept delayed payment if goods arrived by dawn. Amina felt time rush like a bus out of the city. Horns and diesel and the smell of frying oil lost to wind, and she found herself calculating routes, bribes, and prayers in equal measure. She ran from the market to the cooperative leader's office, coaxed porters awake with the taste of roasted yam, and argued with transport boys under a sky that turned copper, as if the earth itself watched the gamble. If they failed, the child inside her would know hunger, and the family line would remain severed. Her heartbeat was loud enough to be a drum for entire villages. Failure would mean eviction, loss of goods, and a long, cold silence in which Chief Adebanjo's words would be the last sound the child learned. On the second day, the pattern broke. The courier who had seen her kindness returned, not with coins but with a connection. His employer ran a small trading syndicate that handled farm produce logistics, and his boss remembered the old woman in the market whose son had spoken of a woman who gave food with no strings attached. The syndicate offered Amina a trial shipment at cost if she could guarantee quality. She promised with the kind of fearless honesty that had been her backbone since being thrown out of her father's compound. Amina and Kemi worked through a night lit by a tired generator and the smell of roasting peanuts, and they loaded the lorry by dawn, breath steaming in the cool, windless morning. It felt like all the small kindnesses and refusals to cheat had converged into a single route to survival and possibly to something greater. Then, at the midpoint of her 3-year arc, the truth that would change everything arrived not as a miracle but as a ledger. Amina's small cooperative's first export contract returned with payment far beyond expectation because commodity prices had spiked, because her quality had been rare, and because the small syndicate had sold the lot to a buyer who paid a premium for traceable, ethically sourced produce. Numbers she had never imagined filled the pages of her account, and she watched them with the same incredulous heartbeat she had felt the night her father had thrown the letter down. She was suddenly a force in a market that had always ignored women who sold akara at dawn. This was a decisive power reversal. She did not become wealthy by a lottery or by inheriting a fortune. She built a supply chain that the city, and then foreign buyers, valued enough to pay for, and within months she could hire back those who had mocked her, buy a corrugated roof for old BC, and register a small company that kept the villagers' names at its heart. For a moment the prospect of immediate revenge glittered. Amina imagined driving a shiny car into her father's compound, waving contracts like indecent fireworks, and telling the men who had sided with him to look upon their shame. But when the darkest shadow fell, Chief Adebanjo attended a meeting to sell a slice of communal land to a hotel developer in secret, a plan that would have displaced dozens. Amina felt the old fight flare in her, and the new woman she had become reach for something else. The choice stood before her like two roads in harmattan dust. She could tear down a man publicly and let pride devour him, or she could buy the offending share, restore the land to the community, and hold her head where dignity would not break. She chose dignity. She thought of the mother she had fed with her last sugar sachet, and felt that the child inside Shahas would inherit not a story of revenge but one of restitution. The climax unfolded in the market square beneath a sky pricked with smoke. Amina walked into the meeting where the developer's lawyers and the elders had gathered, her company's emblem on her chest, and placed a stack of documents on the old wooden table, purchase contracts, proof of funds, and a plan to set up a cooperative trust that would pay royalties to the villagers for every visitor who came to the restored green. Chief Adebanjo's face went through seasons. First an accusation, then a flush of anger, and finally the slow erosion of pride as the room filled with the sounds of phones clicking and reporters asking questions. The developer, smelling scandal, withdrew the offer rather than face a public fight. The men who had whispered and smiled at Adebanjo found themselves sidelined, their reputations dulled by the sudden clarity of who had truly invested in the people and who had only invested in his own name. On screen, as it were, the camera would have caught Amina's hands steady as she signed the papers, and the way Adebanjo's shoulders folded when the crowd turned away from him. What followed was not instant fairy tale healing, but a tangible change you could touch. Amina established a small maternal clinic with a gas-powered refrigerator so vaccines stayed cold when the generator hummed. She gave scholarships to 3 girls from her old compound to learn bookkeeping, and she employed Kemi and several porters who had once refused to lift a sack for her without pay. The compound that had once smelled only of shame now boasted a new well and a community granary with a painted sign, and old BC sat on a refurbished stool under a tree and laughed into the smoke of evening. Chief Adebanjo, stripped of the social bedazzlement his pride had afforded, came to the clinic one afternoon with a bowl of palm fruit as an offering. Amina welcomed him not as a defeated protagonist, honest to trample, but as a man with his own lesson to learn, and when he humbly took up a broom to help clean the clinic yard, the neighbors watched a humble reconciliation stitch itself into the town's fabric. A few months later the market's language had changed. Danfo horns still cried out at dawn, but there were new voices speaking of fair prices and contracts written in the villagers' names, and when the rains washed the red earth, the mud no longer smelled solely of loss, but of work that had paid. Chief Adebanjo came to one of the cooperative meetings and said, in a voice steeped with humility, "I was wrong," and the words landed like rain on parched soil. Amina forgave him in a way that felt like releasing a long-held breath, and the child she had held in that first shaken paragraph grew into a boy who learned the names of the farmers who fed their town. Money had changed the power dynamic, yes, but the city learned anew that wealth without repair is a brittle thing. The new normal was practical and careful, built on purchase receipts and clinic hours rather than on the brittle glitter of ego. Kindness and truth made the bridge. She had chosen to spend what little she had on feeding a stranger. She had kept her honesty when the pastor asked for sermons and not ledgers, and she had refused the easy satisfaction of shredding her father's name for spectacle. Those choices, over 3 years of hunger and stubborn labor, became the architecture of a life that could buy land and sleep without fear. The lesson was plain because she had lived it. Generosity can open doors you do not see, and dignity made of work, and patience can overturn pride that thinks money buys honor. Never judge a life by a single desperate chapter. Small acts of kindness and quiet integrity are the seed bank from which strength grows. Wealth without repair can break a community, but when a poor man rises with care and conscience, she can buy back what pride tried to steal. Truth arrives slowly, but when it comes, it changes not only bank balances but the shape of a town's heart. If this story moved you, tell us what you would have done in Amina's place in the comments below. And if you want more modern folk tales that travel from red earth to city lights, subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications so the next story finds you when the generator hums and the market opens. Rain hammered the zinc as the market square simmered with a new hush, and a black SUV rolled to the edge like a shadow slipping into daylight. A tall man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out, his eyes calm enough to count every bead of sweat on Amina's brow, and when he spoke, the crowd leaned in as if the air itself had become a listening ear. "I am Idris Adekunle," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had learned to move silently through power and poverty alike. "And I am the founder of the syndicate you've learned to trust, the silent partner who has watched you turn hunger into a plan." The languor of market noise steadied into a respectful silence as he raised a thin leather folder and added, "This is a new agreement, not a windfall, but a pathway that will keep your roof from leaking, your children from crying, and your mothers from worrying at night." The interval beat, a twist that felt more like a door softly opening than a door slamming shut, revealed a billionaire who had hidden behind murmurs of traders and pastors, stepping forward to become a partner, not a predator. He would fund a broader cooperative, guarantee fair prices, and build a hospital-grade cold chain for vaccines, a school wing for girls at risk, and a trust that would pay royalties to the village for every export. Amina swallowed the tremor in her throat and asked the hardest question she had not yet dared voice aloud. "What will you want in return, Mr. Idris?" He met her gaze with a gravity that suggested he knew fear as a familiar companion and answered, "Only that you tell the truth when others ask for your silence, that you set your neighbors at the table before you take a seat, and that you allow me to stand with you as you bring the entire community forward." The engines hummed and the generator coughed in the distance, as if the market itself inhaled this pact and held on. T's breath for a heartbeat before exhaling with a murmur of cautious hope. The crowd slowly nodded, and the air tasted of new grain and the faint sweetness of sugar, saved for a hungry mother back in the square, not for show, but for survival. Within a week, Idris invited Amina to a meeting in a boardroom that smelled of leather and lemon, where the village's gossip rode in on the backs of porters and the lights above glowed like a halo over a new vow. There, beneath the glare of a lamp, she learned the specifics. The syndicate would buy the rest of her shares with a long-term loan under a trust that would keep decisions in the hands of those who breathed the dust of the hills, not in the towers of the city. The land would be replanted, a seed bank would rise, and a supply chain network would deliver fresh groundnut oil, cassava starch, and dried fish to towns far beyond the market. Carve out price stability for 3 harvests, and in return a governance model would include a grandmother as chair, a young woman as treasurer, and a secretary who grew up in a compound like theirs. The line between charity and governance blurred into a single, livable map, and Amina felt fear melt into resolve as she whispered, "We will not betray this trust." Back in the square, Chief Adebanjo watched the shift in the crowd's posture. The way eyes stopped flinching at his name and began to search for the names of the villagers who would sit at the table now, and the old pride that had tired at the edges of his mouth since the day he called his daughter's child a stain began to fray. A neighbor's hand reached out to him with a gentle smile and said, not in words, but in a practiced, communal breath, that the river of this town would not be dammed now by a single gatekeeper. Amina walked past the clinic where the refrigerator hummed and the needles slid into arms with clinical calm, and Idris's voice found her again as they stood by the granary painted with the cooperative's emblem. You will travel less, but you will walk farther than you ever dreamed. This map begins here and ends nowhere. In a ledger. She did not smile to relieve him of his own fear, but nodded with the steady certainty of a mother who has learned to test danger with deeds, not words, and his quiet promise felt like a hand steadying hers over a child's heartbeat. The mid-arc turn arrived as a second truth spilled into the room with the soft weight of a relief valve. Idris confessed that his wealth ran not from a single bank or a private army of lawyers, but from a lifetime spent in the margins between dirt roads and shipping lanes, and that his philanthropy grew from a belief that true power is the power to repair what poverty tears apart. He would fund the village's next steps, but would demand a governance ledger that would be transparent to every villager, with a board meeting held in the square where mothers braided and men counted sacks, so that the town would know where money went and who earned it. A local reporter pressed for a direct answer to the temptation of fame, and Amina spoke with a voice that had learned to weigh risk with kindness. Wealth is a river. It can flood or water a village. The test is whether we keep our hands clean and our promises visible. The room breathed. Idris's tie trembled with the weight of an unseen wind, and two porters who had once been paid with sugar pineapples exchanged a look of relief, as if this moment were not just a win, but a restoration of belonging. They had nearly forgotten how to name. The trust's governance would include a grandmother's chair to remind the room of origins, a young treasurer who had hauled sacks to the market, and a secretary who spoke the language of both fields and boards. By the time the first cargo rolled toward the city, the village had learned a new normal. The roof did not leak, the clinic ran cold on the worst nights, and the schoolyard rang with the clack of desks while the generator kept its steady rhythm as hunters turned into teachers and farmers into investors. The wealth gap did not vanish in a single night. It shifted its glare from spectacle to accountability, and Idris's presence, the silent, almost invisible scion of a global conveyor belt, a businessman with the ethics of a village elder, made it possible for a community to demand fairness not as a favor, but as a right. The interval's final image pressed into the memory. The chief, once a stern gatekeeper, lifting a broom beside Amina as the sun slipped behind the trees, while the child she carried learned to hum a tune that spoke of roofs repaired and futures secured. The market's din softened into a choir of names, the mothers, the teachers, the porters, the children, that would tell the story of how a girl from Red Earth turned a line in a ledger into a life they could all inhabit. And Idris stood at the edge of the crowd, a billionaire who preferred the language of repair to the glare of display, ready to walk with them as a witness and a partner, not a ruler. If you listen, the market answers in one long, clear note. The wealth is ours when we keep it honest, and the healing is ours when we share it. And in that note, the interval becomes a new film's first frame, inviting the next chapter to begin. Rain hammered the zinc like a drumbeat that could suddenly rise or drop, but the black SUV that had threaded through the market lane slid to the edge of the square, and Idris Adekunle stepped out with the quiet grace of a man who has learned how to move through wealth without startling the dust. Amina stood with the baby shifting against her ribs, the crowd parting around the two gates of yesterday and tomorrow, as if the city itself held its breath for a verdict that would taste when it was spoken. This is a pathway, not a gift. Idris said, his voice steady enough to calm a market stall and sharp enough to pierce anyone who thought mercy came cheap, and he invited them to walk with him into a governance framework that would keep decisions visible, money traceable, and the village's future in the hands of the very people who had fed it. Grandmother in the chair, a young woman as treasurer, and a secretary who spoke the language of both fields and ledgers. Amina felt the newborn's kick like a small drum within her and asked herself what price she would pay to keep that heartbeat safe, to keep the roof from leaking and hope from becoming a rumor again. The space between old pride and new power shifted in breaths. The developers who had once whispered in the shadows now faced a community that could name its needs aloud. The microcredit collectors found themselves negotiating with a boardroom hush that still carried the market's clamor, and the mothers braided under the tree learned to speak the language of contracts without losing the cadence of lullabies. The Midtown miracle, the first shipment that Idris' syndicate would finance, began to unfold as a daybreak of receipts and blueprints. But the real turning point came when a rumor reached the square in a whisper louder than a crowd. Idris's wealth, some said, was never earned at the table of strangers but built on a bridge of truth that he now asked the village to walk across. Amina, who had learned to measure every breath against hunger, pressed him with a single hard question. If you are here to heal a town, why should we trust a man who has hidden his name behind the curtain of generosity? Idris looked at her, and his eyes softened not with apology but with a candor that could weather a harvest storm. I learned that power leaks when it hides, and the only honest answer is transparency that the whole market can see. I am the silent partner who grew to be a witness, not a ruler. The crowd exhaled as if a dam had released, and the space filled with the rustle of palm-woven bags and the click of laptops and phones as the governance ledger moved from rumor into file, from dream into a schedule of audits, from a promise into a plan that would allow the grandmother to chair in a hall now filled with the light of a school wing and the scent of vaccines cooling in the clinic's refrigerator. And as Amina watched Idris lay out a timetable, the end of 3 harvests when price stability would be assured, the first community trust funded to protect the land, and the first scholarship awarded to a girl from the compound, she felt the old ache soften into resolve, because the wealth gap did not vanish in a moment, but shifted its glare from spectacle to accountability. Yet even as the square gleamed with the glow of a new normal, a subtext braided through the talking heads and the porter's nods. The interval's shadow still lurked in the outskirts, where a certain developer's lawyer had counted on the town's fatigue to slip through a hidden clause that would let him reopen the land sale. A whistleblower's name rose on a flyer, and a reporter's question cracked the air. Would this new frame hold when the first audit revealed the first fault line, or would the ethics of repair prove too fragile for a hill town that had learned to measure time by market days and mothers' breaths? The moment came when Amina insisted on a public read-through of every contract, and Idris, who had watched markets tilt and reputations tilt with them, drew a chair beside hers and faced the crowd with the same calm that had first quieted the generator's moan. A small girl from the compound, hands stained with chalk, rose to read aloud a clause about a grandmother's chair that would outlive any scandal and a ledger that would never hide a single cent. The crowd leaned in, not to judge but to hear, and the whisper that had crawled along the walls of the old gatehouse dissolved into a clear, honest breath. This is a village that can demand honesty and sustain mercy. In the midpoint's turning, a second truth surfaced, not of a hidden villain, but of a hidden ally. A former enemy of Adebanjo, a city journalist who had followed Amina's story from the bench where she slept in a borrowed sari to the table where she signed a future, revealed himself as a guardian of the truth, and produced a dossier proving that Idris's wealth had been welded by years of careful reinvestment in small producers, fair pay, and a transfer of risk away from the poor. Idris admitted a past misstep, an attempt to shield a friend from the truth of a labor dispute, but asked for the chance to rectify it by making every benefit of the new trust public and auditable. a move that not only repaired his own image, but visibly bound the town to the contract as a living promise. Amina's answer came in a voice that carried the weight of a mother who had learned to bargain with wind and hunger alike. "If you want to walk with us, you walk in the light of what you claim to protect." The bond between them tightened, and the ledger's pages thickened with names, not numbers alone. The women whose tuition would be paid, the porters who would be paid a fair wage, the shopkeepers who would benefit from a predictable price, and the elders who would see a future where the land, once a target for sale, would stand as a trust for restorati. An ordinary market, now a classroom of accountability. By the time the first cargo rolled toward the city, the square's chatter had grown into a chorus. Roofs stopped leaking, the clinic ran on a reliable supply chain, the schoolyard rang with the clack of desks instead of the sighs of hunger, and the people who had once whispered about Amina's child now whispered about the child's future and the story of a grandmother who could call the ledger her grandchild's birthright. Chief Adebanjo, who had once clung to a gate he could close with a word, stood beside Amina at a fundraiser for the granary and brushed away a tear as he admitted aloud that pride had sometimes been a wall in need of a door, and that a community, not a king, must decide who may eat and who may dream. Idris, with a quiet smile that never set him above the crowd but always a step ahead to guide it toward safety, reminded them that wealth, if shared, becomes a river that nourishes every bend, and that a village's healing is only as strong as the honesty with which it spent its money and the care with which it held its neighbors to account. The interval's frame held. The town's heart learned to beat in the same rhythm as the banked breath of the child, and as the market hummed back to life with a new, quiet dignity, Amina turned to the people who had walked this path with her and found in their faces the same resolve she had carried from the first bench under the chapel's creaking wood to this square where a grandmother's chair and a girl's ledger now spoke the same truth. That kindness rewarded is a village's greatest fortune, that justice served can mend a lineage, and that the next frame, whatever it holds, will begin with a choice as ordinary as paying a debt, or as brave as forgiving a debt that was never owed in the first place. If you listen, the market answers not with a shout but with a steady, hopeful hum. The wealth is ours when we keep it honest, and the healing is ours when we share it. And as Idris steps back to let Amina lead the room, the child in her arms coos a soft, almost secret tune that sounds like a vow to walk a longer road, and the camera, from a distance but never far, rests on the two figures shoulder to shoulder, the grandmother's chair behind them, the ledger open in the light, and a horizon that remains just beyond the tree line, inviting the next chapter to begin.